So, hello everybody. Welcome to today's event on defensive nationalism with Beth Rabinowitz. As the more observant of you will be able to tell, I am not, in fact, Professor Daphne Halikiopoulou. Unfortunately, Daphne has gone down with COVID and isn't able to join us today. We do send her our best wishes for her swift recovery. But we are delighted to be joined with Beth Rabinowitz, Associate Professor of Political Science at Rutgers. And I think something of a polymath with the number of different areas that Beth has covered: political institutions, leadership, comparative political economy, nationalism, ethnic conflict, and of course now nationalism and populism. The book we're talking about today is, of course, Defensive Nationalism. Just before we start that, a quick announcement. We have our summer school taking place in June at the University of Zadar in Croatia. Applications are open for that on our website at asen.ac.uk. It's linked on the front page. Do go and take a look. We've got a fantastic set of guest lecturers at the summer school. John Fox, Jonathan Hearn, Sasha Bozic, Leah David, John Hutchinson, Erin Jenné, Simona Kuti, Gizim Krasniqi, Sinisha Malashevich, Sabina Mikhail, Gordana Uzelac and Maya Tudor. And it's also on the shores of the Adriatic, which may be a selling point as well. All the information you need is on the website. Also on the website, Beth has done a couple of handouts for the presentation today. If you go to asen.ac.uk, on the front page in the top right there is the link to Beth's talk, and the handouts are linked there. And I will put the links in the various chats momentarily. I think that's everything from me. With that, Beth, over to you.
Thank you, David. I want to thank ASEN and thank you and thank Daphne for organizing this and inviting me to come. I'm thrilled to be here. I can't really see anybody but David, so I apologize if someone is there that I can't see and can't recognize. I'll say sort of quickly before I put up slides that I welcome questions. I'm going to try and speak first in sort of a presentation, and then I believe David will be asking me questions, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that anybody else may have. So I'm just going to put up my slides right now. Okay. I should have, let's see. Okay. So as you see, this is the cover of my book, Defensive Nationalism, Explaining the Rise of Populism and Fascism in the 21st Century. This book is relatively sprawling in terms of a lot of the things that it covers. Although it is focused on defensive nationalism, I do develop a theory of political change that's based on Karl Polanyi's double movement mixed with Joseph Schumpeter's ideas about innovation. And then I have 8 comparative historical chapters that seek to show the empirical evidence for the theory that I develop. I'm not going to go into most of that today, which is why I posted those handouts. If anybody has any interest in either how I've done the comparative history or what the broader theoretical model is, those sort of give you that. And if anybody wants to ask me any questions about any of that, I'm happy to answer them. But today I'm going to be more focused on the question of nationalism, as I believe that would be more interest to the majority of you. And so I want to also start by prefacing how this project began. I actually began this in 2015. A slow labor of love, and stupidly was writing 2 books at once. But and in 2015, what brought this to the impetus behind this was that this was a period when we were talking about Brexit, we were talking about Trump's campaign, his first campaign, we were talking about Gabor's illiberal liberalism, we were talking about Marine Le Pen and her, electoral successes, but these all seem to be very siloed. There wasn't, I at that time didn't feel that there was a lot of literature out there that was helping explain how these things interconnected. And as someone who studied nationalism, as I'm sure for some of you, I saw that there was this heightened nationalist rhetoric. And so I was trying to understand, what does that mean? At the same time, I was about to teach a course on nationalism and ethnic conflict, and in going through my syllabus, I wanted to see if I could find something that could speak to how the kind of surge of nationalism we were seeing at that point was related to earlier forms or surges of nationalism. And I didn't find much there either. And so both of those set me on this path to trying to understand what it was that we were seeing. And so, as you are aware, I mean, all these processes have only escalated. Now, it's relatively common for us to talk about nationalism, nativism, populism, even fascism. At the time, it was not. And, and we're seeing just increasingly bizarre elections. We just had this in Argentina and Holland. We are seeing political polarization globally in democracies around the world. We're seeing threats to democracies around the world. We're seeing rising international tensions in, formerly sort of sedated or states that had borders that were relatively stable after Bretton Woods that seem to be crumbling on the edges. So is there a way in which we can understand how all of these things interrelate? And I'm answering yes, I believe there is. And I believe that defensive nationalism is a concept that can be very helpful in understanding all of these processes and why they're happening all at once and across the world and why they're happening now. So to begin with, I'm arguing that what we're seeing is this generalized structural response to structural changes, macro structural changes in the global system. And that's why we see this kind of simultaneity and this spread across the globe. But for today's talk, I'll be talking about what defensive nationalism is, and I'll be introducing my typology of nationalism that I've developed as a way to both address why we seem to see anti-global populism as the essence in many ways of our world today, as well as a just sort of different way to think about nationalism and organize it. I'll speak more briefly to my explanation for why it has emerged. I won't really speak to Polanyi and Schumpeter, but if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer them. And then I'll briefly speak to what I think the implications are for where we might be headed. So I would just begin very simply with what is defensive nationalism? And so basically I've argued that defensive nationalism is the place where populism and nationalism converge. And so in the simplest terms, we understand for the most part, if we strip it down, that populism is a vertical opposition between the populace and the elites. And nationalism is a horizontal opposition between us and them, in groups and out groups. And I'm arguing that the two of these get mapped onto one another. And so the opposition with defensive nationalism is both sort of horizontal and vertical. It's the global enemy against the nation. So it still has the same kind of character, but it has the characteristics of both nationalism and populism. So in order to understand this, I've created, as I said, this new typology of nationalism, basically just trying to organize it into different categories than it has traditionally been organized, not as a way to necessarily say this is a new way to study nationalism, but perhaps as a way to understand the different pieces, the manifold numbers of theories and studies that we have and how they might interrelate to one another. So I've identified these three processes or moments or aspects of nationalism. One is creative nationalism, which is the process through which nation states come into being. The other is consolidating nationalism, which is the sort of regular process through which national identities are solidified and reimagined. And then finally, defensive nationalism, which emerges in response to changes in globalization. And it's that impetus to preserve and protect the sovereignty of the nation. So I'll begin again with creative nationalism. And so, as I said, this I see as any kind of movement that claims there is a nation, that seeks to define it, that seeks to rally people behind it as a cause. And usually it's geared towards establishing statehood for that nation. Although, as we know, there are nations without states. For example, in the US, we have the Native American sovereign nations that are not states and do not seek statehood. Nonetheless, it's generally what the impetus is behind creative nationalism. As an object of study, I think there are some primary focal points that we can identify under this rubric. One is that it focuses on strategic ways in which people are galvanized to the nation, which looks at both, the emergence of national elites, the definition of the nation, the definition of the citizenry, the concepts developed of what makes the nation unique, and whether that's in terms of literature, arts, or the national character, or the unique national myths. And a key part of that would be the construction of the national history, focus very much on its hardships and heroes. And in this, of course, I'm following Ernest Renan. In terms of research on creative nationalism, I would put under this, again, both larger sort of theories of how nationalism comes into being as a process, the great writers, Gellner, Anderson, and Brubaker, and others, as well as the enormous number of specific case studies we have about how nation states of different places have come into being. Consolidating nationalism is very different. Consolidation nationalism happens within an existing nation state. It can focus on similar kinds of processes in terms of identifying the nation and what the nation is, but does so in more everyday practices. This is close to what Billings identifies as banal nationalism. And so within that, there's both informal and formal processes. The informal is what we do on holidays, the way in which we write poems or songs about the nation state, and celebrate our foods or our unique national identities. Formally, it would be involving things like changes to citizenship laws or national curricula, which then help either solidify or reimagine, in some cases, what the national identity is and who the citizenry are. And so, as an object of study, again, it's really those studies that look at how nation states bolster themselves, how national identity is unified and reimagined. And I think the two great works I sort of point to are Eugene Weber's work on Peasants into Frenchmen, in where he looks at late 19th century France and how the rural areas, people had much more localized sense of identity. Very few of them saw themselves as French. The French were in Paris somewhere. And many of them didn't even know who Napoleon was. And he looks very systematically at the way in which the French state instituted national systems of education, military conscription, and legal systems as a means to incorporate these rural areas into the nation and create a national identity. In a different vein, Waldstretcher does a similar kind of process, though very different, for the United States, where he looks from the mid 18th century to the early 19th century, the post-revolutionary America, how Americans developed an American identity away from a British identity. Sorry, guys.
We forgive you.
How we stopped celebrating Guy Fawkes Day and started to celebrate Independence Day, and looks at various in a similar manner to Benedict Anderson, how almanacs and calendars and holidays help facilitate the creation of that national identity. And then again, there's defensive nationalism. And here, as I said, I believe defensive nationalism is where nationalism meets populism. It's something that comes in response to globalization and globalizing forces. And it's a people's movement focused on reasserting national sovereignty and particularly shielding the nation from external threats. So to further differentiate among these sort of types or moments of nationalism, I use the analogy of evolutionary biology and say that, we could think of consolidating nationalism as closer to what evolutionary biologists identify as static equilibrium, where the species or the is slowly adapting to change over time, and so it's slowly morphing, but you wouldn't see it all at once or any great specific moment of change. And as a result, we wouldn't speak of consolidating nationalism as an era or an epoch, because it's something that's just continually happening in every nation state. However, to the contrary, I see creative and defensive nationalism as closer to what is identified as punctuated equilibrium, where you have a very quick exogenous shock, which creates relatively quick changes, and which can therefore, because it's the same kind of exogenous shock around the world, it can happen serially in a number of different nation states. And so we can perceive it as a wave or an epoch or an era of nationalism. So, for example, with creative nationalism, I argue that it becomes an era in response to the fall of empire. And so I've identified what I believe to be three great eras of creative nationalism. The first of the 19th century with, post-Napoleonic Europe and the fall of the series of empires and the emergence of a number of nation states that happen across the continent. We see this with, and actually we could say this of Latin America too, which also is related to that transformation. We see this also in post-World War II with the demise of colonialism, and from the 1940s to the 1970s, the emergence of a number of nation states across Africa and Asia and the Middle East in particular. And then finally, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s and all of the states that come and emerge out of that, and for all of these periods, this is focused on creative nationalism, identifying the nation, understanding what the nation is, mobilizing people around this idea of nationhood, differentiating between citizens and non-citizens, and all those processes. An era of defensive nationalism, as I alluded to earlier, I believe comes in response to modern globalization, and I'll speak to what that is in a second. But it's about this process of being hit by globalizing changes, which can hit countries simultaneously with equal force, and can therefore, multiple states at the same time can experience comparable kinds of levels of dislocation, and therefore comparable kinds of concerns about threats to national sovereignty, and out of which we can have similar kinds of political responses. And so what I think this does is it helps us understand the simultaneity of these responses across so many different countries without denying the very specific national histories, the very specific national settings, the very specific national leaders that emerge, and how those can differ from place to place. Yet we need to, I believe, understand what the pattern is and why there is a pattern. So that is my focus. And so modern globalization, we know globalization has been happening forever. We could think of it under the Mongols. We could think of it with, the great trading systems that developed in the 12th century, all of this. But modern globalization has specific kinds of characteristics. And to this, I appeal to David Harvey, Danny Roderick, and Frederick Jameson. First, Harvey's idea of the fact that with this kind of globalization, you get this enormous time-space compression, that was sort of popularized as the world is flat at one point in the 90s. or Danny Roderick speaks about it as hyperglobalization, this increased and accelerated interaction among states, instantaneous information, flows of trade, flows of people, flows of ideas at speeds and in to the degree that had never existed before. And one of the key components is that capital itself becomes free floating, that capital then begins to expand, that you see the emergence of finance capital, international speculation on a much broader scale, which also has important impacts. And so in this, I'm following Karl Polanyi. For those of you who are not familiar, Polanyi wrote a great work, The Great Transformation. He was writing in the 1940s. He was a man who was born in the late 1880s, who lived through World War I, who lived through World War II, who was forced into exile right before World War II, and who studied Marxism and was both sort of embracing and critical of it. And so Polanyi gave us a really interesting observation that what was unique about the 19th century was this new form of globalization, although he didn't put it quite in those terms, and that it had two antithetical parts to it. That globalization, this new modern form of globalization, was born out of two principles. One was this increasing economic, political liberalism that was spreading through the world, spreading free market ideologies, spreading, critiques of government, and allowing free markets and free exchange to rule the world. And at the same time, that excess of free markets created all kinds of social dislocations that Polanyi argued the society could not sustain. And so society sort of pushes back against that. And we see this almost immediately, he tells us, with protectionist policies on the part of states. But also this is a period where you start to get labor union movements, women's movements, environmental movements. So all of this he describes as, the social protection part. And so Polanyi says that the late 19th century was a period of what he's calling the double movement. Again, this movement towards high liberalism and then towards anti-liberal responses. And so many people have argued that it's likely that we are in a second double movement, that this is a valuable concept. And so part of my project in this book was trying to find a rigorous way to explain how we got to a second double movement. In effect, how can we argue that history seems to be repeating itself when, of course, we know history doesn't repeat itself, but what makes these periods so similar? And so this helps answer also this broader question which we're hearing, which is the question, why now? Why this rise in populism, this rise in nationalism, this rise of fascism? Why in the 21st century when no one had expected that would be what would come after the 20th century? And so my argument sort of embraces both Polanyi and Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter, unlike Polanyi, does not see the transformation in the 19th century as increased liberalism that's born from free-flowing capitalism and free markets. He sees it as a result of innovation. And he argues that what sets any kind of cycle in motion is new innovations, new technologies, and that they bring about increased speculation, increased need for credit, which then creates a boom economy, which then has a series of others innovations that emerge and in response to that, and that the economy grows and capitalism grows with it, and eventually the bubble busts and you go to a downturn. And so he argued that the reason you went from high liberalism to communism and fascism was not because, again, of the spread of free markets and the spread of ideologies about free markets, but rather because of these changes in innovation. And in particular, he argues the changes of railroads. And so I'm taking Polanyi and saying Polanyi does not do a good job of explaining how high liberalism emerges. I think that Schumpeter does a better job of that, whereas Polanyi does a better job of understanding how high liberalism turns into communism, fascism, and world wars. And so combining them, I'm arguing that Polanyi's second half, where society pushes back against things, is amorphous, and I'm calling that defensive nationalism as a means for us to understand both how it happens across so many countries and how we can study it individually within a country, and that it's set off by changes in transportation and communications, and that those specific kinds of revolutions allow for the creation of new economies of speed and economies of scale that lead to the kind of hyperglobalization that Danny Roderick is describing, that generate both wealth and internationalism, but also, as Polanyi observes, produce enormous social, economic, and political dislocations that then lead to what I'm saying is this response of defensive nationalism. And so, as I've identified that there are these great waves of creative nationalism, I argue that there were two great waves of defensive nationalism. The turn of the 19th century, which was the rise of the Second Industrial Revolution, which produced a number of different kinds of communications, transportation technologies that connected the world in never before known kinds of means. And similarly, the turn of the 20th century, the aerospace and digital revolutions, which had parallel kinds of forces. And so in my book, I'm comparing 1860 to 1920 and 1960 to 2020. And I know that sounds very cute. The reason for the periodicity is, though, I'm looking at when these transportation technologies take off, so to speak. And I found, in the 1860s is when railroads, although Britain was ahead and had a pretty sophisticated railroad system by the 1850s, but most countries did not. And it was in the 1860s that you really see the expansion of railroads across Europe and the United States and into places like Argentina. At the same time, you're getting steamships, which radically transform how goods and people are brought around the world. And similarly, it's the 1960s, that's the jet age. You had airplanes before in the 1920s. Not a whole lot of people were on them, not even in the 1950s. But the 1960s with the turbojet, then you start to get affordable and more comfortable air travel. And so you start to see an enormous change in how human beings, again, are being transported around the world. At the same time, you get changes in container ships, which also dramatically change the way goods and trade are done and allow it to be to rise exponentially. And similarly, you have changes in communications during these periods. It begins at this period, right? So in 1958, it's the first time you have the intercontinental cable that's laid across the Atlantic. It allows for the internationalization of telegraph, which then is followed in many countries. And this is the first time you have instantaneous communication across countries at such a large scale. Ticker tape also facilitates that, is also developed around the same time, which allows for the instantaneous information about all kinds of goods and stocks, which will bring into being all kinds of new forms of trade and securities. And then at the same time, you have enormous changes in printing, both the construction of new forms of paper out of wood pulp instead of cotton rags, as well as the rotary printing press, both of which allow for very fast and cheap production of paper and printed goods, which leads to things like pulp fiction, but also leads to mass media. The first form of mass media, which were the large penny presses and large newspapers that emerged at that time. And as we know, the 1960s and 70s is when you start to get the rise of the aerospace and communications revolution. It's really in 1972 that you have the first internet, which was, or 70, sorry, where, you had 3 universities communicating with one another, and that gets expanded. It was the beginning of that. You have communications satellites in 1962, which start to change the way in which information can be transmitted globally. And in addition, you have the silicon chip, which allowed for solid state computers instead of tubes. And that allowed to make increasingly smaller computers, increasingly strong computers, as well as cell phones. So all of these things, right? With communication satellites now, you get also things like cable television that can be broadcast around the world, and you get the internationalization of media. And so in my book, I look at common kinds of dislocations that occurred in both these periods. I examined 7. You could look at others as well, I'm sure. But, in both periods, you had this titanic shift in production, right, from agriculture to industrialization, whereas in the second one, it's from the Fordist model of industrialization to flexible production. Both of these leave large areas in the sort of periphery in limbo and privilege the urban areas in terms of economic development. You have increased speculation that also leads to increased finance and finance connections around the world and produces global market failures. You have in both these periods enormous wealth concentration that's also directly related to these new revolutions. Most of the wealth concentration, the robber barons, were from railroads and banking. The wealth concentration today is largely in terms of people who are on the cutting edge of technologies, as well as in banking. So very similar in that way. In both periods, you get mass media that leads to fake news. In the late 19th century, you had the penny presses, as I said. For the first time, you had an expanded audience, what led to enormous competition for market share that led to very sensationalized news coverage where fact and fiction were blurred. Similarly, with our new technologies, even more so, we have the spread of information that's false and dangerous. Of course, labor migrations, both periods were periods of enormous demographic shifts largely to sort of countries that had the new industries from countries that did not, among other kinds of shifts. And then, interestingly, these are both periods in which you have new forms of global terrorism. So the first global terrorism were the anarchists in the 1880s and 1890s. The idea of propaganda of the deed, which was the idea that anarchists had to stop making speeches and start doing something much more radical. And by that, they meant something violent as a way to wake people up to the dangers of capitalism and why things needed to change. And so they were the first to lob bombs into cafes and operas, which was horrifying to people who had never seen that kind of violence before, and also horrifying because it was across so many countries at the same time. Similarly, the next time we get this kind of global terror is with Al-Qaeda. We had various forms of Islamic terrorism before, but it was all focused on national concerns, whether that was the PLO or it was the brotherhoods. Those brotherhoods were all, the Egyptian Brotherhood, they were not globalized. And it was with Al-Qaeda that you start to get this idea of reasserting the global ummah through this sort of violent terrorist tactics, which also use new tactics that we'd never seen before. Aside from the spectacular bombing on 9/11, you have horrible beheadings that terrify people, suicide bombings, and you have it spread across the world simultaneously, which wreaks all kinds of fear. And then lastly, I include actually that with these changes, you have political liberalism, and that transforms societies. And in particularly, it starts to challenge traditional patriarchy and religious orders, which has a particular effect, obviously, on the right. And by way of an example, I look at the expansion of women's enfranchisement across the early 1900s, and then the passage of gay marriage in the early 21st century. And both of these gender movements are almost parallel in the way in which they go sequentially across countries, and also their impact on traditional ideas of traditional society and how they helped politicize certain areas or groups. So here is my sort of flow chart of what I'm arguing. And so the one thing I add to Polanyi and Schumpeter, right, globalizing tech is Schumpeter, liberalism and social dislocation is the double movement of Polanyi. And then I add that in the middle of that, you have populist leaders that emerge in response to all of this that help produce movements of defensive nationalism. And so in this, I'm borrowing both from the literature on populism, which differentiates between demand side and supply side of populism. And so the demand side comes from the anxiety of these globalizing changes and all of the things that people have identified in terms of immigration and changes to the economy. And then the supply side comes from, the idea that in populism, they talk about parties and political elites, but, in nationalist and ethnic conflict, we speak about ethnic entrepreneurs and instrumentalism and how they also politicize and mobilize people, often for their own gain, although sometimes genuinely, for around these kinds of concerns and ideas, right? And so, moreover, I'm sure I'm running out of time, but so I also argue that, like populism, defensive nationalism manifests itself both on the right and the left. Unfortunately, it's often taken to mean something like nativism, and that is not what I mean. And so the similarities on the right and the left are that in both instances, the focus is anti-globalization and the focus is on national sovereignty and social protections of some sort. The difference is in how the global enemy and the national people, that key opposition, are identified, what the orientation and goals are. And so I have this sort of chart of the different dimensions. And it's less national people for the left. I would say less class-based, more like civic nationalism, about categories in relationship to citizenship and territory. Whereas the right-wing version of the national people is nativist and more like what we've described as ethnic nationalism. But equally, the globalizing enemy is conceived of differently. So for the left, it's understood in class terms. So it's the capitalist system, it's the multinationals, it's the wealthy individuals like the Murdochs and the Kochs that are manipulating things, that are buying politicians, and that are controlling both the global economy and political economies and politics. For the right wing, I argue similarly that it's identity-based, it's embodied, the enemy is embodied. It's not the capitalist class or the system, rather it's the Jews who are manipulating things. Or for Trump, it was the Chinese who were doing currency manipulation and spreading disease. And it's equally embodied in those strangers in our midst who are outpopulating us, outvoting us, and threatening the core nation, the core bulk, if you will. And so, as you can see, there are therefore different kinds of concerns and ways of looking at it. The orientation, I believe, for the left is what we could describe as progressive, because it's about gaining rights and enfranchisement for those who've not yet had them. And for the right, it's retrogressive in that it's looking to restore national greatness and patriarchal kinds of traditions. And rhetorically, the left defensive nationalism is more about rights and equity. It's based in core Enlightenment values, whereas the right is more fear-based. It's focused much more on group survival and genuine fears for some of genocide, often white genocide. And it's an anti-Enlightenment kind of process in which it's not about rights and equality, it's about tradition, it's about natural hierarchies, natural order. Men and women are different, cultures are different, some cultures are superior to others, and cultures need to be protected and preserved. So sort of the early forms of, say, German nationalism. I don't know if I should continue, David, or...
I mean, do you want to run through for another 5 minutes or so
Okay, good.
And maybe wrap up,
Okay.
and then that gives us some time for Q&A.
All right, great.
I don't want to
So,
cut you off because I'm really enjoying this, but
oh, great. I'm
do want
glad to
I do
hear
want to have some time for questions at the end.
it. So, there are some advantages again that I believe that this concept brings. One of them is because it has these core attributes of both being anti-global and being focused on national sovereignty. It allows us to differentiate this kind of populism from other forms of populism. So, for example, there are other forms of left-wing populism. Say at the late 19th century, communism and anarchism were left forms of populism. They were anti-globalization to the extent that they were anti-capitalist and the anti-capitalist system. However, they were also anti-nationalists, right? The nation, this whole idea of nation state was a bourgeois plot to divide the people. They talked about the proletariat uniting across nations. They sang the song, the National, which was all about this, right? Um, um, and similarly, we saw at the end of the 20th century, in the 1990s in particular, this idea of anti-globalization, WTO, anti-WTO movements, but they were not nationalist movements. They coined the term glocal, which was the idea that the local is the global. And the idea was that now with this new technology and with the internet, we could democratize the struggles against these kinds of capitalist forces. We can allow people across nations to join hands to support the weaker nations, to support labor, environmental movements, indigenous movements, and not focused on protecting the nation state at all. Similarly, we can look at right-wing movements that are nativist, that are not defensive nationalist. So, for example, I use the example of the KKK, which emerges in the United States after the Civil War in response to the enfranchisement of Black populations. It's certainly racist and nativist, but it's not anti-globalization at all. It's very focused internally. And similarly, one could argue in the 1980s, for example, Reagan, Thatcher, Berlusconi all had elements of nativism and right-wing populism, but they were not by any means anti-global. So again, one of the advantages of this concept is it helps us differentiate this from other forms of populism. Another value to this concept, I think, is that it helps us understand the concomitant rise of nativism, protectionism, polarization, and militarism across so many countries at the same time. That's twofold. First, because it's inward-looking and anti-global, it tends towards isolationism and it tends towards hawkishness and fear of global threats. And so, as national populists sort of gin up a fear of the global enemy, it helps spread fear and distrust of larger international forums, whether that's the Euro or the WTO, or the UN and all those other kinds of international forums. Or it also sort of undermines the processes of diplomacy. Those who embrace defensive nationalism, diplomacy takes a backseat because it's about nationalism first and foremost, particularly on the right. And also particularly on the right, it's the military that emerges both as the protector of the nation state, as well as sort of the image of its greatness and its might, and part of its restoration of the great nation. And so I believe we're seeing the effects of this already, where, as I sort of alluded to earlier, we're seeing sort of the unraveling of the Bretton Woods world, in which there was relative stability among developed countries in terms of borders, in terms of interactions. We see this first with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We also are seeing sort of increased volatility between the US and China, between the US and Russia. All of this sort of, I think, pointing to this kind of effect of defensive nationalism, as well as Israel and Gaza, which I see is very much growing out of the right-wing defensive nationalist government of Netanyahu, and the increasing ways in which that became the center for that government that led to this really horrific conflict. On the other hand, also, defensive nationalism is a populist movement. And so at its core, it's about distrust of existing authorities. It's distrust of institutions and elites. And that means that there's no possibility for a center. The center is what the establishment has been. We need to get rid of the center. We need to look for new voices. And those new voices come from the right and the left and from the poles, not from the center. And so that eviscerates the possibility for political middle ground at any large scale. And I think, again, we're seeing this playing itself out in these bitter election battles around the world and increased polarization. So where does this leave us? I have to warn you that I have been a Chicken Little, and largely, I've been right in my prognosis, but I've also been more negative than what has happened. So hopefully I'm continuing on that vein. But I do fear that we are in this period of defensive nationalism, which is focused on distrust of the system, increased insularity, heightened militarism, and that spells out a recipe for political turmoil. And so were I to make any kind of prediction, I would say at the very least, I expect polarization, fascism, these kinds of conflicts to be trends that will not be abating anytime soon. We do have some bright moments like we had in Poland, but I think the general thrust is towards defensive nationalism, and we should be bracing ourselves for more of the same. So I don't know why I'm ending with a smile, because that's very depressing, but that is where I'll end today.
Yeah. Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Admittedly, somewhat depressing prognosis. Might I say people have been talking a lot about populism and the rise of populism. I think you've done a fabulous job of really getting grips to it and explaining where that rise comes from. I've got a few questions. I'm going to say, if for people watching, if you're on Facebook or YouTube or Zoom, if you've got any questions, do put them in the chat, and I'll pass them on. There's one thing. Like I said, I've got a bunch of questions. One though, just to start with, Polanyi and Schumpeter aren't obvious bedfellows.
No.
I know you sort of pull that together, and you've got the sort of duality with the economic liberalism and the social rights from Polanyi, and if you like the creative destruction from Schumpeter. Do those sit together well enough, or is that something that still needs resolving? How those two views or those two sets of dynamics work together?
Well, so in my humble opinion, I think they do, but because I think they complement one another. So as I write in the book, I think, Polanyi is a little hazy about how the double movement is set off in terms of liberalism. He says that it's sui generis and that it's from the rise of finance capital. But why does finance capital emerge? And why do we therefore need the gold standard? And I don't think he does a very clear, has a very clear explanation of where that comes from. In fact, if I may, I could actually show you a
Please.
slide. Let me see if I can find it. So one of the things I looked at was I compared Polanyi's, I guess I can just tell you, I compared Polanyi's idea of the gold standard as being the beginning of all of this, and Schumpeter's idea of technology as being what really set things off. And what I found is that Schumpeter statistically makes more sense. So Schumpeter identifies railroads, and with railroads, he argues you have new forms of banking, and that's when national banks begin to be established around the world. And he is in fact right. That is when national banks begin to be established in the 1850s. At the same time, he doesn't speak to this, but finance capitalism really starts to change in the 1850s with the Pierre brothers and the Credit Mobilier, which was a new form of lending. They were competing with the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and so they gained their wealth through financing railroads in France, and then were interested in getting into this speculation in in the United States, where a lot of the speculation was going, most of it. And so they developed this new form of long-term debt, which then this credit mobilier kind of model spreads around Europe. And so if we look at that, we can see that both of these are starting in the 1850s. Whereas if you look at when the world really starts to go on the gold standard, it's not till the 1870s.
Yeah.
So I think Schumpeter makes a much more compelling argument of how you get the rise of liberalism and finance capitalism. Yeah. However, Schumpeter becomes very fuzzy in understanding the end of capitalism, which for him is unfortunate, right? This great moment of capitalism and freedom comes to its own demise. Obviously, for Polanyi, he thinks that's a necessary change.
And that, I suppose that's can capitalism survive, or as capitalism changes from one form to another, what havoc does it wreak? I've got a couple of questions from the various chats that I'm going to go to in a moment. But just on that, I suppose one question I had is we've got these large changes going on and sort of several things at different times. Is it the particularities of those changes that matter, or is it just the fact that you've got a lot of change all at once? Could you have similar large scale changes, but that perhaps don't have the same dislocating effect, or the dislocating effect is better managed without causing those things, or is it any big change like that in a sort of compressed period of time is going to lead to this reaction of defensive nationalism?
So I'm thinking, for me, it's about the combination which brings about modern globalization, which then creates that kind of interconnectivity that brings about all this disjointedness. So for me, it's the combination of all these factors happening at once. And it's not just demographic change. It's not just economic change. It's not just political liberalism. These things are working in tandem. And so that has that increased impact as I see it. But I would also argue that it can be mitigated, the responses, by political actors. And so there are places where we have seen more moderate leaders who've not led us into the extremism of defensive nationalism. And so, I do believe it's on the right and the left. I don't, at this moment, have a good explanation for why the right seems to be more robust than the left. But I do believe at both times, I started in 2015. So we were seeing a surge in sort of socialism that had not existed for a while. It had been sort of disreputed. And, both with Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, right? But, Eurosceptic parties, and the US, we see the rise of the anarchist parties and things like that to a certain extent. So I do believe that political actors can mitigate this. And I believe very strongly in the power of political leadership in directing and channeling people. But whether or not that will be what comes to pass is a different story.
Hope springs eternal, I suppose. And
the one last thing I would say is, one of the things I did, and that's why I gave you the handout, was I compared in extensive ways these turn of the century processes, right? And now I've just lost my train of thought. Sorry.
I'm going to take a question from someone who I think is well known to you, Catherine Boone.
Hi, Kathy. I can't see you, but
Catherine asks, says, thanks, Beth. How would we explain why some right-wing nationalist movements are not populist while others are? Does differentiating between the two require you to argue that some countries or groups are less dislocated by the forces of globalization and technological change? That is, the non-populist right-wing movements are not dislocated, but the populist right-wingers, countries or groups within countries, are dislocated.
So I guess, Kathy, can you explain to me what you mean by non-populist?
Wait for Catherine to answer that, if you can, in the chat. In that case, I'll go on while we're waiting for Kath to come back. Might go on to a question from Hans Siebers,
I'm sorry. So let me also say, I'm seeing these right-wing movements as proto-fascist movements, and fascism itself is, in its definition, right? It's about both extreme ultranationalism, but it's also sort of fits oddly between the left and the right, in that it's about mobilizing the population against the establishment, even though it's also about conservative values. So fascism differs from conservative movements. So I don't see defensive nationalism as akin to conservative movements on the right, but rather more akin to fascist, proto-fascist movements.
I mean, I suppose that also opens up a question about how these are going to develop, because they can, there's potential for them to go very much in the sort of fascism that we'd recognise from the 30s and 40s, or into something still deeply unpleasant, but perhaps not quite as damaging. If it's okay, I'll take Hans Sieber's question, who says, "Thanks, Beth, for a very illuminating presentation. It clarifies a lot. One point is not clear to me. If I get you right, you argue that defensive nationalism can be left and right. I don't see how it can be left-wing. Can the left be something else than global emancipation movements and human rights? Is the message of your talk that civic nationalism has become impossible and there can only be civic globalism?"
Wow, civic globalism, I don't even know. That's a big one. Adam Smith would say that's not possible. Humanity can only reach so far, and it's only at the nation state that it can have its sympathies. I don't take any position on that, but I would say I do believe it's both on the right and the left. And that was one of the things I was trying to explain, that we have this polarization, and that there are elements in both the right and the left that are they're both Eurosceptic parties that were on the left. We're speaking to this anti-global concerns. We're speaking to the need to protect the nation from these economic forces. And so in that, I see that as a defensive nationalist kind of position.
It's a shame that, for many reasons, Daphne isn't here, because a few years ago, Daphne Halikiopoulou, Kyriaki Nanou, and Sofia Vassilopoulou put out a paper called The Paradox of Nationalism. One of the things they argue, I thought quite convincingly, but in fairness, Sofia was my supervisor, so I probably would say this, that actually the people you see in Europe at the moment making strong Eurosceptic arguments based in sort of a nationalist frame are the far right and the far left. So they are quite different in that to the sort of, yes. It's no longer arise ye prisoners of starvation. It's no longer the Internationale, but they're making these quite national arguments for where they're coming from.
Exactly.
I've got a question from Jonathan Hearn. Following on from this, thank you for a very lucid talk. Do you see any forms of centrist nationalism forming in relation to these defensive nationalisms, i.e. that assert unity across left-right divides within contemporary nation states? Any hope for this?
So, I am Dr. Doom and Gloom, but, as I said, I do think defensive nationalism leads to polarization. Again, because as a populist movement, the center is not trusted. And so who are going to be the righteous voices that are going to speak against establishment? They're going to come from the right and the left. We have had some people who are fighting to be centrists. Biden is one of them, I would say. But they struggle for credibility. And so could they win out in the end? I hope so. Will that happen? I'm not sure. I'm concerned that as we progress and as these tendencies continue, it will give more oxygen to those on the extremes rather than the reverse.
I'm not a Gramscian, but pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, I think, or optimism of the spirit. Let me take a question from Facebook from Chris Cannell. Thank you for a fascinating talk. How does nationalist separatism as a response to globalization feature in your theory? Is it not a form of creative nationalism as opposed to defensive, even if it is populist. There are both left and right versions of this too, e.g. in Europe, Scotland and Catalonia, as opposed to a putative northern Italian separatism.
Yeah, so those are absolutely creative nationalists. I would say that they're not in response to globalization, though, right? I mean, the Catalonians and the Scottish and these separatist movements have been around forever. And so, yes, they're absolutely what I would categorize as creative nationalism. But I don't think that they have much to do with this response to globalization, if that answers the question.
Can I sorry, go ahead.
Did I miss a piece of that question?
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay.
No. Can I pick up on that, on the creative nationalism, defensive nationalism? Because one of the you set out the description of creative nationalism at the start, and I wonder if we can understand defensive nationalism, the modern defensive nationalism, as a process, if you like, of a new coming into being. So it's not just reasserting the state, but sort of to an extent redefining what it is. I'm thinking here. I mean, you had Ernst Renan on there. Qu'est-ce que c'est la nation? And in that, of course, he's got the line. It's a daily plebiscite, and part of maybe what's going on with nationalism, with defensive nationalism, is redefining who counts in that daily plebiscite. And so, is that again a sort of a new coming into being, rather than?
So that sounds more like what I've described as consolidating nationalism, right? So consolidating nationalism for me has similar elements to creative nationalism, but it's not focused so much on establishing a new nation state as it is on reimagining or redefining or rebolstering an existing nation state.
So would you say then that the consolidating nationalism is a form of, if you like, of hot nationalism? That when there is, for whatever reason, nationalism is a live issue, but you can have periods between consolidating nationalism and so on, where you fall more into the process where you've got the banal nationalism that we're all familiar with, and so the consolidating nationalism isn't a continuous process between creative and defensive, but something that happens in relatively discrete periods.
It happens over time, as I said, sort of, it's an accretion, and I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I think that's a good point, David, that yeah, I think it could be something that can be more reactive at times, with new politicians coming in and sort of activating ideas of, ins and outs and what citizenry is and why it's under attack or something like that. But I would still say, maybe banal nationalism doesn't cover it, and maybe that's a good point, right? But I would still say it's that process of integrating an existing state, not against global enemies, right? Nor is it about carving out a new state that had not existed before. So that would be the differentiation.
Okay, right, yeah. No, that does make sense. The other question I wanted to ask, there's something you mentioned where I think you're effectively using sort of philosophy of biology, talking about punctuated equilibrium. Yeah. I find that just a very interesting frame. We had a talk, an ASEN talk last year, where somebody was doing something similar to explain sort of diversity of forms of nation or nationalism, as a response to different different things going on in the world. So, I suppose what I'm getting at is how much variation would you expect? Because obviously you've got these large scale processes, but each nationalism is in its own particular environment.
Yes.
Given the broad frame, how much variation would you expect? In where you see defensive nationalism emerging. I was actually trying to think of the sort of counterexample, and I actually couldn't think of one off the top of my head where we don't see a counterexample. I couldn't think off the top of my head of a country where you don't have some form of defensive nationalism at the moment, but you have it to a greater or lesser extent.
Yes.
Right. Do you think that it can be something that is just greater or lesser, or is everybody on this, if you like, on this journey, on the train or the jet plane towards the sort of description of defensive nationalism you set out?
You know, when I set out in 2015, I would have said there were those that were not really there, maybe Canada or whatever. But I think increasingly that's not even a possibility any longer. Everybody is there. But yes, there is a continuum. And, you know, it does relate to, as I said, national histories and national leaders. There are going to be differences, absolutely. And I think a lot of it's going to have to do with how people are being mobilized politically by political entrepreneurs.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
And obviously this is the supply side as well. You know, what are people? You know, how are people reacting to that? And I
mean, you know, one of the things about the mass media, right? You know, that as we know today, is that, you know, it silos peoples and stuff like that, and in a really unique way. You know, so I talk about the turn of the century and how the new media, the new mass media with the new printing capacities allowed for both a decentralization and a centralization of media, right? So you had a proliferation of suffragettes papers and, you know, anarchist papers and, you know, these smaller tabloids that were being vetted around, as well as the large newspapers that emerge that sort of corner market share and sort of monopolize news media. Today, I guess the internet would be the more decentralized form, although it's sort of confusing because then it's kind of centralized on something like Facebook, which really controls the algorithms and how we see one another. And so, you know, that obviously feeds into how people are responding, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I'm just going to take a last round of questions, if that's all right. Another one from Hans is defensive nationalism the same as reactionary nationalism or restorative nationalism?
Yeah, I guess, you know, I mean, it is reactionary and it is about restoring the great nation. Yeah. So, but that's on the right.
Mm-hmm.
The restoration part is on the right, not on the left. The left is not so much concerned with restoring national greatness as living up to sort of the ideals of the nation, right, in terms of equity and rights. So I would say they were different. I mean, it was striking to me, you know, I had these quotes from description of these proto-fascist movements at the end of the 19th century, these anti-Enlightenment movements. They were, you know, they were the counter-revolutionary movements against the French idea of liberté and égalité, right, and these ideas of humanity. And let me see if I can read the quote to you. Oh dear. I took everything out of my talk to make it seemingly less confusing. Let's see. Let's see if I can find it. But he describes how this guy Pulzer, who writes about fascism, describes this period in this counter-revolutionary moment as sort of a new form of romantic, heightened romance. Let me see. And sorry, taking forever to get there. Here it is. It's this counter-Enlightenment movement. And so Peter Pulzer says, the later romantic despised rationalism and the Enlightenment. He detected the sin of intellectual arrogance in it. He championed intuition against analysis, imagination against empiricism, faith against the intellect, and history against science. He rejected the individualism and cosmopolitism of the preceding generation, which seemed to overemphasize the happiness of the individual. Well, not all of that fits, but I think a lot of that fits with what we're seeing on the right in terms of denial of science, denial of expertise, the rise of really bizarre conspiracy theories, the sense that one's intuition is much more important than facts, you know, and that, you know, we should be trusting bloggers in their basements who have intuitions rather than formal media. So I think, you know, there are many ways in the book that I explored the parallels in these sort of political movements that emerge, and that's one of them. That this is this is what I would call, as counter-enlightenment is part of the right, as reactionary and part of the right.
I can't help but think about the UK recently, where we've had a minister talking about the 15-minute cities conspiracy and saying that local councils are going to be restricting how often you can leave your area. We had a Secretary of State a little while ago saying that the British people were fed up of experts, and so on.
It was chilling to me to see that, because it was just so descriptive of so much of what we're seeing today, and that was written about the 1890s.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to end because we're just about out of time with one last question, if I may. You mentioned, I suppose, if you like, the hope for politicians who will challenge this defensive nationalism. What else do you think there is anything else that can be done? What is to be done, or do you feel pretty pessimistic about the future? Because I can't help but the other thing I thought of, you had all of the different comparators. The other one that came to mind was the Spanish flu and COVID, and not
that's on my list of.
It's on there as well. But the first period you're talking about ended up, well, badly, shall we say?
Yes, exactly.
Do you think that something similar is likely now? And I'm thinking particularly the US-China situation. And how do we avoid repeating history?
David, the more I study history, the more I see it repeats. Reading Cicero's description of, the populist movements that were bringing in Caesar, it could have been written today. The enemy is inside. So, this is the problem with making a macro-structural argument, right? In that it's sort of quasi-Marxist, that it's very deterministic. I do see it in sort of deterministic terms. And, in the book, I refer to the fact that, there are theories of cycles, capitalist cycles of great wars among, the European powers, at least, cycles of hegemony. And even though I'm looking at a 100-year cycle, I'm not expressly saying it's because of that, but I do personally believe there is something to that. And I do think we are at the end of the 100 years peace from Bretton Woods, and that is crumbling. And that concerns me. I do believe we could be moving towards some kind of international conflagration. I don't know what that would look like. And I do believe that things will get worse before they get better. But again, hopefully I'm Chicken Little and I'm horribly wrong.
Well, let's try to work towards it. I suppose I was just thinking there the juvenile quote about who would put up with the Gracchi complaining of subversion came to mind. Populism and those sort of appeals like that are, as you say, they go back a very long time. Beth, that has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you ever so much for giving your time. Defensive Nationalism is available now. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's available in all good bookstores. If you go to a bookstore and they don't have it, it's not a good bookstore. Do please try to support your local bookshop. Just before we finish, to remind you that applications are open for our summer school, asen.ac.uk, and it's on the front page. And our next event will be at the end of February. We're still finishing putting that down, but will be from last year's Anthony D. Smith Fellow.
David, may I also just say
please.
So many nice comments in the chat, and I just want to thank you all for your very, very nice comments, and it's nice for me to hear that you found this informative and helpful.
It's been fascinating. With that, thank you very much. Well, wherever you are in the world, have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Recording